The Cleveland Browns didn't just make a football decision. They made a bet on something far bigger than arm strength, playbooks, or rookie development curves. Quietly, without headlines screaming about it on draft night, the Browns aligned themselves with a completely different kind of quarterback, one who didn't enter the league asking for permission, guidance, or validation. What arrived wasn't just a player, it was a fully formed ecosystem. Most rookies walk into the NFL hoping to earn relevance. This one showed up with it already built, an audience, a brand, a monetization engine that didn't need the league to switch on. And that's why this move has league executives uneasy, because buried beneath the surface of what looks like a normal rookie contract is a decision that may have shifted the balance of power in professional sports without a single public confrontation, without a lawsuit, and without anyone raising their voice. There's been a lot of buzz online suggesting that the Browns didn't simply draft Shedeur Sanders, they partnered with him. Not in the motivational, PR-friendly sense teams love to promote, but in a structural, economic way that challenges how rookies have always been handled. If even part of what's being reported is accurate, this wasn't about waiting years to cash in. The value was already there, already moving, already independent. And that's the detail most fans missed. This story isn't really about Sundays, it's about ownership, about who controls the money, the image, and the distribution when a player becomes the product. For decades, the NFL has been the gate. Fame flowed through it, revenue depended on it, visibility required it. But what happens when a player walks in and doesn't actually need the gate opened? People close to the situation say this wasn't spontaneous. They claim this was years in the making, shaped long before draft boards and scouting reports ever came into play. And it's impossible to separate that from the influence of Deion Sanders, who has spent decades warning athletes about a system that profits from their labor while limiting their control. Instead of fighting the system head-on, the approach here was quieter and potentially far more effective. What makes this moment different isn't that money was made early. That's happened before. It's that the structure itself may have changed. If the reports are even partially true, the Browns didn't just sign a quarterback, they acknowledged a new reality where commercial autonomy can matter as much as completion percentage. And once that door opens, even a crack, it never really closes again. Because the uncomfortable question now isn't whether Shedeur Sanders can succeed on the field. It's whether the league is prepared for players who succeed without needing it first. And if that sounds dramatic, just wait, because the part that's really rattling the NFL isn't even the money, it's what comes next. From the moment his name entered the conversation, this pick carried a different kind of weight. Not because of hype, and not because teams suddenly forgot how to evaluate quarterbacks, but because Shedeur Sanders didn't profile like a typical rookie. Most young quarterbacks are assessed almost entirely on projection, arm talent, decision-making under pressure, how long it might take before they're ready. Sanders arrived with something most prospects don't even think about yet, leverage that had nothing to do with football. Reports and industry chatter suggest teams weren't just studying his tape, they were studying his footprint, his audience size, his ability to move attention without league assistance. That alone separates him from the standard rookie mold. While others enter the NFL hoping exposure will follow performance, Sanders flipped the sequence. The exposure was already there, and performance would simply amplify it. This is why the selection felt less like a gamble and more like a calculated alignment. The Cleveland Browns weren't just asking whether he could win games down the line. They were asking what happens when a player shows up with his own distribution channel, his own community, and his own commercial gravity. That's not a question most front offices have had to answer before, and it forces a different kind of evaluation. One that blends football scouting with business reality. There's also a timing element that matters here. The league is in a transitional phase where attention is increasingly fragmented. Traditional broadcasts still matter, but direct-to-fan ecosystems matter more than ever. A quarterback who already understands that landscape carries value beyond the stat sheet. And while no team will ever admit they're drafting for clicks, it's hard to ignore a player who brings relevance with him the second he signs. What really made this feel unusual was how little resistance there appeared to be. No public tension, no messy negotiations leaking into the media, just a quiet confidence that whatever Sanders brought to the table, it wasn't a threat, it was an asset. That alone signals a shift in mindset. Instead of worrying about control, Cleveland seemed willing to let autonomy coexist with team structure. And that's the key difference. This wasn't a rookie trying to stand out. This was an organization recognizing that the landscape has changed and that the next generation of quarterbacks won't just be judged by what they do between the lines. They'll be measured by how much value they generate everywhere else. But that advantage didn't appear overnight. It was built long before draft night, and understanding how that happened explains everything that followed. To understand how this situation even became possible, you have to zoom out past the draft, past the rookie contract, and past the headlines. This isn't a sudden power grab or a flash of arrogance. It's the result of a long game, one shaped by someone who's been calling out the mechanics of professional sports long before most players even knew they could question them. Deion Sanders has never been subtle about how leagues profit from athletes while convincing them that control is the price of opportunity. For decades, Deion talked about ownership when everyone else talked about exposure. He warned players that once you sign away your image, you don't get it back. That your name, your highlights, your identity could be monetized endlessly while you're paid once. At the time, those comments were dismissed as noise, bravado, or outdated grievances. But they weren't complaints, they were blueprints waiting for the infrastructure to catch up. That's where Shedeur Sanders enters the picture. His rise wasn't just about football progression, it was about platform fluency. While fans were focused on wins and rankings, something else was quietly being built in parallel. Content pipelines, audience trust, direct communication channels. It's been said by people close to the situation that none of this was accidental. The idea wasn't to wait until the NFL provided a spotlight. The idea was to arrive with one. At the University of Colorado, Sanders didn't just play quarterback, he practiced visibility. Every appearance, every clip, every moment of access was part of a larger system designed to turn attention into autonomy. And unlike earlier generations, he wasn't experimenting blindly. He had a mentor who'd already seen what happens when the league owns the narrative and the revenue that comes with it.
What makes this factor so important is restraint. There was no public campaign, no open challenge to the NFL, no speeches about reform. Instead, the strategy lived in preparation. Build the leverage first, then negotiate. If reports are accurate, the goal was never to fight the system, it was to work within it so cleanly that resistance wouldn't make sense. That's why this doesn't feel like hype. Hype demands attention. This approach avoided it. By the time people started noticing, the infrastructure was already in place, the audience was already engaged, and the contract discussions weren't theoretical. They were built around assets that already existed. That's the Deion Sanders factor. Not noise, not rebellion, just patience, experience, and a refusal to repeat mistakes that too many athletes didn't realize they were making. And once that foundation was set, the next move wasn't about proving anything publicly, it was about translating years of warnings and preparation into something enforceable, something written, signed, and protected. And that's where the story takes a very different turn. This is where the conversation shifts from theory to tension, because once whispers started spreading about something called the Prime Equity Clause, the reaction around the league wasn't excitement, it was caution. Not because anyone knew the exact language, but because they understood the implication. If even a portion of what's being claimed is accurate, it represents a structural deviation the NFL has avoided for decades. It's important to be clear here. Rookie contracts are not fully public documents, and the NFL is famously tight-lipped about customized clauses. What follows is based on reporting, agent chatter, and leaks circulating among media and legal circles. Nothing has been officially confirmed line by line, but the consistency of the claims and the silence disputing them has only amplified curiosity. According to those reports, the so-called prime equity clause centers on control rather than compensation. Instead of routing all off-field value through the league's traditional licensing systems, it's been said this structure allows Shedeur Sanders to retain expanded authority over how his name, image, and digital content are used, not symbolically, functionally. That distinction matters because symbolic ownership doesn't generate leverage, actual control does. What's particularly striking is how this clause is described as operating outside the typical revenue-sharing machinery. Normally, a player's popularity is absorbed into the league ecosystem. Jerseys, highlight clips, social media usage, those benefits flow upward before they trickle back down in fixed percentages. The claim here is that this clause breaks that default pathway, not by challenging the collective bargaining agreement, but by sidestepping at areas where individual rights were never explicitly waived. That's why legal experts aren't calling this a loophole, they're calling it an omission that finally got used. Contract law is clear. If you don't give something away, you keep it. Most rookies surrender those rights automatically because they don't know they can negotiate otherwise, or they're told it's standard and non-negotiable. If reports are accurate, Sanders didn't accept that premise. He inverted it. What makes this even more disruptive is that it's allegedly non-performance-based. This isn't about bonuses, incentives, or hitting benchmarks. The value exists whether he starts, sits, or waits. That alone reframes how rookies are normally positioned, dependent, replaceable, and earning trust over time. The prime equity structure, as it's being described, assumes value from day one. And that's why no one in the league is rushing to clarify it, because denying it outright could invite more questions, while confirming it would legitimize a model others are already studying closely.
Truth likely lives somewhere in between the rumors and the reality. But even a diluted version of what's being discussed is enough to change how contracts are approached moving forward. Because once players realize certain rights were never mandatory to surrender in the first place, the entire negotiation landscape shifts. And whether the prime equity clause is exactly what the internet claims, or something more subtle, it's already forced a conversation the NFL would rather have avoided. What really set off alarms wasn't the clause itself, it was what allegedly happened right after the ink dried. Because almost immediately, reports began circulating that money was moving before Shedeur Sanders had taken a single professional snap. No debut, no starting announcement, no Sunday highlight. And yet, value was already being extracted at a pace that doesn't usually exist for rookies. To understand why this matters, you have to look at how it usually works. Most incoming players spend their first year proving they belong. Endorsements come later. Merch catches on after a breakout performance. Brand value is conditional. But in Sanders' case, that order appears to have been flipped. The audience was already there. The engagement was already active. All the league provided was a uniform, not a launch. Online reports suggest that jerseys moved fast, faster than expected, faster than veterans in the same market. And while exact figures are impossible to verify, what is clear is that the structure allowed Sanders to benefit from that momentum immediately, rather than waiting for the league's distribution timeline to catch up. This wasn't about hype spiking, it was about access to value that was already being created. What makes the situation even more unusual is that this income wasn't tied to performance clauses or traditional incentives. There was no need for touchdowns, touchdowns for snaps, or snaps for relevance. If the claims hold, this revenue flowed simply because fans were already invested. That's a drastically different foundation from the one most rookies stand on. There's also an important distinction here. This wasn't a one-off endorsement splashed across social media. The buzz suggests multiple streams working simultaneously. Merchandise, digital content, partnerships, each feeding into an ecosystem that existed independently of the team or the league. Even if the reported numbers fluctuate, the mechanism itself is what matters.
The machine worked instantly. And that's where discomfort sets in, because when a player can generate meaningful income without stepping on the field, performance stops being the sole gatekeeper of profitability. That's not how professional football has been structured. The NFL has always been the value amplifier, but here it may have simply been the multiplier to something already operating. This isn't being framed as wrongdoing. No rules were broken, no systems were hacked. If anything, the structure followed the rules precisely, and that's what makes it so unsettling, because it exposed how much money has always existed at the player level and how little access most players had to it. And once that realization hits, it doesn't stay isolated. Veterans notice, agents notice, front offices notice. The conversation quietly shifts from "when will he earn" to "why couldn't others?" And that question doesn't have a comfortable answer, especially for a league built on centralized control.
The loudest reactions didn't come from fans or media panels. They came from quiet conversations happening behind the scenes. Veteran players, guys who've been in the league long enough to know how the system really works, started paying attention the moment the implications became clear. Not because they were upset, but because they recognized something they hadn't been shown early in their careers. For years, most veterans signed what they were told were standard deals, image rights bundled in, licensing language glossed over. Little attention paid to how long those terms would last or how deeply they reached. At the time, it made sense. Make the roster, stay healthy, get paid. Everything else felt secondary. But what Sanders' situation highlighted was that the real concession wasn't salary, it was ownership. According to agents and league insiders, older contracts are being revisited, not out of bitterness, but out of awareness. Players are asking different questions now. Who owns the clips? Who controls the distribution? Where does the money actually flow once my name is attached to something? These weren't mainstream concerns a decade ago. Now they're unavoidable. What's striking is that this hasn't sparked open resentment. There's no visible divide between generations. Instead, it's triggered clarity. The realization that many players didn't lack leverage, they lacked information. The deals were structured efficiently for the league, not optimally for the athlete. And once you see that distinction, it's impossible to unsee it. This goes beyond individual regret. It reshapes how negotiations are approached. Veterans understand that while they can't retroactively rewrite history, they can set new boundaries going forward. New extensions, media usage, personal brands, everything becomes a point of discussion rather than an assumption. That shift alone alters the power balance. What Sanders' situation revealed is that the model wasn't immutable, it was habitual, and habits exist until someone disrupts them calmly enough to avoid backlash. That's why this moment matters to veterans, not because one rookie earned early, but because he proved the structure itself could be challenged without confrontation. And once players at the top start thinking this way, it trickles down fast. Rookies listen to veterans, agents adjust their playbooks, front offices feel pressure they can't publicly admit yet. This isn't loud, it's quiet, procedural, and deeply uncomfortable for institutions that rely on uniformity. Because when the people who've already paid the price start asking smarter questions, the next generation doesn't walk in blind anymore. And that's when a single contract stops being an exception and starts looking like a precedent. Once the conversation moved beyond the locker room, it didn't stop at football, because the implications of what's being discussed here are bigger than any single league. People across the sports world are watching closely, not because they want to copy everything outright, but because they recognize a framework that can travel. And that's where this story starts to widen. In basketball, individual star power has always carried outsized influence. The league already leans toward player-driven economies, and yet even there, the idea of retaining deeper control over image usage and distribution is generating quiet interest. Executives understand that today's athletes don't just compete on the court, they compete in attention markets, and whoever controls that attention controls the leverage. Outside of the major US leagues, the interest is reportedly even stronger. Soccer organizations, combat sports promoters, and global federations are all navigating the same tension. How do you keep centralized systems intact when athletes can reach fans directly? The model being discussed here doesn't dismantle leagues, it bypasses their exclusivity, and that's a very different threat. What makes this framework especially attractive is its adaptability. It doesn't require collective bargaining overhauls or public confrontations. It operates quietly within existing contract law. Retain rights, define permissions, build independently. That simplicity is what's turning heads. It's not radical, it's clean. There's also a generational shift accelerating this spread. Younger athletes are growing up in a creator economy. They understand branding, monetization, and platform ownership the same way past generations understood endorsements and sponsorships. To them, this isn't rebellion, it's efficiency. Why surrender value you're capable of managing yourself? And the leagues can see it coming. Once a single structure proves durable and profitable, imitation isn't optional, it's inevitable. Even diluted versions of this approach would change how negotiations are handled across sports. The moment players begin asking for conditional licensing instead of blanket rights, the power dynamic shifts. This is why the reaction hasn't been public. No league wants to legitimize a model that reduces their control by openly acknowledging it, but the interest is real. Lawyers are studying it, agents are modeling it, teams are weighing whether flexibility becomes a recruitment advantage. And that's the key. This isn't about one quarterback or one franchise. It's about whether professional sports can continue to operate on centralized assumptions in a world that no longer requires them. Because once athletes learn how to build value without intermediaries, every league becomes just one option among many, not the final authority. At its core, this isn't really a money story, it's a control story. For decades, professional sports have operated on a simple assumption: the league owns the ecosystem. Teams manage players, players supply the labor, and the league controls the narrative, the imagery, and the distribution that turn that labor into profit. It worked because there was no alternative, but that assumption is starting to fracture. The tension right now isn't about revenue loss, at least not yet. It's about losing command over how stories are told and where value flows. When players own more of their identity, teams stop being owners of attention and start becoming collaborators. That's a subtle change, but a dangerous one for institutions built on uniformity and hierarchy. Historically, leagues maintained control through centralized media rights. Highlights lived behind permissions. Images belonged to licensing arms. Players had asked to use their own moments. That structure reinforced the idea that visibility itself was a privilege granted from the top down. If reports around this situation are even partially accurate, that model no longer applies cleanly. This is where partnership enters the conversation. Because once an athlete shows they can bring value independently, the team's role changes. It's no longer, we make you visible, it becomes, how do we align without getting in the way? That reversal is uncomfortable, especially for organizations used to setting the terms unilaterally. What's interesting is that this doesn't eliminate team identity or loyalty, it reshapes it. A partnership-based model still values performance, culture, and success, but it acknowledges that players are no
Longer empty vessels waiting to be filled with branding. They arrive preloaded. And when that's the case, control becomes counterproductive. This shift also exposes why resistance is so quiet. Pushing back publicly risks validating the very leverage leagues want to contain. But internally, there's anxiety. Because centralized systems don't adapt well to fragmentation. Player-owned ecosystems create multiple centers of influence, and that's the opposite of how leagues have historically maintained order. Yet teams willing to embrace this reality may gain an advantage. Flexibility becomes currency. Offering autonomy becomes a selling point. And suddenly, the teams clinging hardest to rigid templates look less traditional and more outdated. The real power shift isn't happening through protest or headlines. It's happening through contracts that reframe relationships. Athlete is partner. Team is platform. League is one component of a larger economy. That's not a collapse, it's an evolution, but it's one that forces the question no league can avoid forever. Do you want to control players or work with them? So the real question isn't whether this situation is unusual, it's whether it's repeatable. Because once a model proves it can work, quietly, legally, and profitably, it stops being an exception and starts becoming a reference point. What we're looking at here may not be a one-off moment, but the early outline of a new rookie blueprint. For years, the path into professional sports followed a familiar script. Sign the deal, surrender control, focus on performance, let the league handle everything else. What this moment suggests is that the script was never mandatory, just accepted, and that distinction changes everything. When a player like Shedeur Sanders arrives already fluent in audience building and ownership, the negotiation doesn't start from zero, it starts from leverage. That's why this isn't about ego or rebellion, it's about preparation meeting opportunity. The ability to ask different questions, to challenge assumptions without confrontation, to treat a contract not as a uniform, but as infrastructure. And once that mindset enters the pipeline, it doesn't leave with one player. Teams now face a choice. They can cling to standardized agreements and risk losing top-tier talent that wants more than salary, or they can evolve into partners willing to meet athletes where they already are, digitally, commercially, and culturally. The Cleveland Browns appear to have made their decision early, and whether others follow may determine who stays competitive off the field as much as on it. The deeper shift is philosophical. This isn't about being bigger than the league, it's about not being dependent on it for relevance, income, or identity. The NFL may no longer be the launch pad. In some cases, it's simply the landing zone. And once that realization settles in, the balance of power doesn't swing back easily. So, is this the future of rookie contracts? Maybe not immediately, but the precedent is now visible. Invisibility changes behavior. Players will ask smarter questions, agents will prepare differently, front offices will weigh flexibility against tradition, and somewhere down the line what feels disruptive today will feel normal. Because the most dangerous shifts aren't loud, they don't announce themselves, they arrive fully formed, already working, and daring the rest of the system to catch up. And whether leagues like it or not, that's the blueprint that's now on the table.